The podcast begins with an exploration of the limitations inherent in a strictly physicalist and reductionist worldview. Dr. James B. Glattfelder, a complexity scientist and physicist, reflects on the discomfort many feel when confronted with the scientific narrative that 95% of the universe, encompassing dark energy and dark matter, remains fundamentally mysterious. This gap in understanding contributes to a pervasive sense of nihilism, where life seems random, devoid of meaning, and ultimately insignificant. Glattfelder suggests that this crisis of meaning demands a metaphysical shift, a reevaluation not just of science, but of consciousness itself. The discussion emphasizes that science excels at describing how things work, but remains silent on what stuff actually is. This scientific boundary challenges the prevailing notion that reality is solely physical. Glattfelder points out that the early pioneers of quantum mechanics were deeply engaged with metaphysical questions, but later generations dismissed such inquiries as irrelevant. Today, however, scientists are beginning to revisit these philosophical implications, indicating the need for an evolution in consciousness and metaphysical frameworks in order to better grasp reality and reclaim a sense of purpose. Glattfelder discusses a paradigm shift where consciousness is being reconsidered as fundamental rather than derivative. He explains that while the traditional view sees the universe as composed of particles, basic stuff arranged in deterministic ways, quantum mechanics reveals a bizarre, illogical underlayer to reality that defies straightforward meaning. Modern research into quantum contextuality underscores that properties of particles do not exist independently but emerge only upon measurement, which blurs the distinction between observer and observed. Idealism posits that an immaterial field of universal consciousness underpins physical phenomena. This concept is difficult to assimilate using purely rational and scientific approaches. Still, Glattfelder notes there is growing scientific merit to this worldview, especially since it aligns well with thousands of years of spiritual and mystical traditions. Embracing consciousness as primary shifts questions from what is matter to what is awareness, which opens the door to richer metaphysical models capable of addressing the hard problem of consciousness, one still unsolved by physical science alone. Moving beyond intellectual debates, Glattfelder highlights the experiential side of consciousness studies. Indigenous wisdom, shamanism, contemplative traditions, and psychedelic explorers have long cultivated alternative states of consciousness that offer direct encounters with a non-physical dimension. These transcendental experiences frequently dissolve the strict self versus other identity, revealing a unity with all that exists. Such states cannot be fully communicated through language or rational explanation. Instead, they offer an expanded awareness accessible through practices like meditation, trance, breathwork, and sacraments such as ayahuasca or LSD. Scientific studies corroborate that psychedelics can induce shifts toward idealist interpretations of existence and also enhance well-being. The resurgence of interest in these fields represents a cultural and scientific renaissance that reintegrates ancient metaphysical insights with modern inquiry. A central theme emerged around the role of ego, or the individual self-identity, as both a source of suffering and a barrier to deeper awareness. The ego cultivates a sense of separateness that breeds conflict, disconnection, and a survival-focused mindset. Glattfelder and the hosts discuss how practices that quiet or break down the ego, through meditation, psychedelics, or altered states, allow individuals to experience non-duality and interconnectedness, key insights in spiritual traditions worldwide. The dissolution of ego boundaries gives rise to feelings of love, unity, and compassion that often transform one's worldview and behavior. This transformation has societal implications. Greater interconnectedness fosters ecological awareness, social cohesion, and even peace, concepts that contrast starkly with the isolation and competition fostered by materialistic paradigms. Thus, accessing transcendental states may be vital for individual and collective healing in the contemporary world. Dr. Glattfelder elaborates on scientific analogs to metaphysical ideas, particularly the notion that reality emerges from information rather than solid stuff. This resonates with the concept of the Akashic field or Akashic records, terms from esoteric traditions describing a universal repository of knowledge accessible beyond physical constraints. Quantum physics' emphasis on information as a foundational category gives a veneer of scientific plausibility to the idea that consciousness taps into a broader, intelligent informational field. According to this model, the brain functions more like a receiver or transmitter tuned into the consciousness field rather than a generator of awareness itself. Phenomena like intuition, synchronicity, or even creative inspiration might be manifestations of accessing information from this field. The conversation brings attention to serious contemporary research into such ideas, suggesting that modern science, albeit cautiously, is starting to entertain that the universe is more than particles interacting mechanically. It may be an intelligent, purposeful continuum imbued with meaning. The dialogue acknowledges the practical limitations and risks of psychedelic use and other consciousness-expanding methods. While substances like LSD or THC hold potential for opening expanded awareness and improving mental health, they also carry dangers, including overwhelming experiences or addiction. Glattfelder shares his own adolescent encounter with LSD, highlighting the importance of setting, maturity, and integration in such journeys. Alternative practices like meditation, breathwork, and yoga offer safer pathways to exploring consciousness without pharmacological intervention. These modalities cultivate neuroplasticity, emotional regulation, and access to non-ordinary states, though they typically require sustained effort and discipline. Ultimately, whether through drugs or discipline, consciousness expansion opens channels to deeper wisdom, but must be engaged responsibly within contexts that support mental and physical well-being. The podcast delves into phenomena often dismissed by mainstream science: intuition, synchronicities, and psychic or remote viewing experiences. Glattfelder and hosts argue that these may be legitimate indicators of a higher ordering principle or non-local connectivity beyond physical space and time. Rather than random coincidence, synchronicity could suggest an underlying meaningful framework accessible to consciousness. While skepticism is natural, the accumulation of experiential and even experimental data calls for open-minded inquiry rather than dismissal. Recognizing these phenomena as part of consciousness's broader capabilities invites a more integrated understanding of reality that blends subjective experience with objective investigation, and it underscores the necessity of overcoming biases rooted in outdated materialist dogma. The pervasive cosmic nihilism born from a reductionist worldview, where existence is meaningless and life is random, is addressed as a sociocultural malaise in urgent need of remedy. Re-enchantment involves restoring awe, wonder, and meaning by reconnecting with the mystery and intelligence that infuse the universe. This reframing encourages a shift from despair to gratitude, from fragmentation to unity, and from survival to creativity. Glattfelder articulates that re-enchantment is not about abandoning reason, but expanding it to include a symbolic, playful, and poetic engagement with reality. This shift could alleviate many psychosocial maladies by anchoring people in a reality that offers purpose and belonging, key antidotes to stress, depression, and nihilism dominant in modern society. Cultivating joy and compassion through consciousness work is portrayed as a critical survival strategy on both personal and collective levels. The discussion returns to physics and cosmology to highlight pressing enigmas that problematize the traditional map of reality. Dark matter and dark energy constitute roughly 95% of the cosmos, yet their nature eludes understanding. Quantum mechanics reveals phenomena such as contextuality and measurement-dependent properties that defy classical intuition. These developments signal that the long-held materialist assumptions are inadequate. Such scientific mysteries justify revisiting metaphysical interpretations that place consciousness at the foundation of reality. Glattfelder suggests that universal intelligence or purpose might be encoded within the universe's evolution, the will to complexity, and that our current scientific frameworks are incomplete but not necessarily incorrect. This integrated perspective may guide future scientific revolutions and clarify how mind and matter relate. The podcast explores the intersection between ancient mystical traditions and modern scientific thought. While institutionalized religion may be criticized for dogmatism and division, the core mystical experiences of communion with a loving intelligence remain resonant and foundational for understanding consciousness. Mystics across cultures describe encounters with cosmic unity or divine play, Leela, fostering acceptance of suffering and a deeper sense of purpose. Glattfelder argues for moving beyond static dogmas towards dynamic spiritual frameworks that embrace complexity and evolution. This includes honoring indigenous knowledge, contemplative practices, and psychedelic insights. The unfolding of the divine or consciousness in physical form is seen as an ongoing process with implications for humanity's spiritual awakening and the cultivation of peace amidst global crises. A particularly fascinating segment revolves around the nature of alien encounters and psychedelic-induced experiences. The conversation posits that entities encountered during high-dose DMT journeys, often described as machine elves or alien intelligences, might represent accesses to non-physical realms of the universal consciousness field rather than physical extraterrestrials. This challenges materialist interpretations and expands our understanding of intelligence as multifaceted and multi-layered. Survey data demonstrates commonalities in such encounters, suggesting they are not mere hallucinations, but possibly genuine interactions with aspects of reality normally hidden. These experiences dovetail with near-death encounters, shamanic rituals, and psychic phenomena, raising questions about the architecture of consciousness and the boundaries between inner and outer worlds. Such ideas blur the lines between science fiction, spirituality, and emerging science. As the podcast draws to a close, Glattfelder offers reflections for scientists, spiritual seekers, and the broader public alike. He exhorts scientists to remain humble and open-minded about phenomena beyond current explanation, and to embrace interdisciplinary conversations that consider metaphysics and consciousness seriously. For those on a personal journey, he invites an inward turn to cultivate self-awareness, compassion, and experiential wisdom. The hope is to bridge worlds, to synthesize rigorous scientific understanding with the richness of inner experience, to integrate meaning and purpose into modern life, and to foster a collective evolution of consciousness capable of addressing global challenges.